Hello, welcome to Bro History. I'm your host, Ben Mealy. Before we start, I want to go ahead and say that the podcast and the opinions therein are the opinions of the podcasters themselves and no entity or organization otherwise. So sit back and enjoy Bro History. Hey, welcome back to Bro History. I'm Ben.
Hey, and I'm Zach.
And today we're going to be talking about the Soviet space program and the horrible, crappy N-1 rocket. So Zach asked to do the intro on this, and I'm going to pass it over to him.
Well, I wouldn't say it's horrible and crappy there, Ben.
I would.
Such a work of art. It's a beautiful rocket.
Negative.
Anyway, so the year is 1960. The Soviets and the Americans both have the top Nazi scientists that they could steal post-World War II plugging away on the rocket program.
Via, on our side, Operation Paperclip, and via the NKVD kidnapping people in their sleep on the Russian side.
Yeah. And what this did is we got the top rocket scientists in the world. Everybody sucked at rockets except for the Nazis. They were building them and launching them at the UK and building jet engines and all kinds of stuff. And the best we could muster was, a P-51. It's not a rocket.
Well, it's pretty fast.
Yeah. Fast as a Mustang on angel wings.
I mean, Britney Spears isn't even like a spear.
No.
So,
in 1960, the United States announces that we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Wow. Nobody would have thought that was anything besides science fiction. The Soviets get wind of this, and they're like, yeah, you know what? We're going to beat you to the moon. And we're going to build this super awesome rocket and just get there and make you guys look real stupid because communism was better than capitalism.
Whack.
But upon examining how the N-1 rocket program worked, we're going to discuss how that might not have been such a great idea, possibly ill-conceived at best. So, let's begin talking about the program and what this N-1 rocket is.
All right. So, good intro, Zach. Appreciate it. So, as is tradition, what we kind of did with the last one, we are going to talk to the history of it. So, really, this all kind of fits into the space race, of course. The key rocket designer on the Soviet side was a man named Sergei Korolev. Korolev, whatever. And he was the guy that really invented all of the key rockets, the Soyuz rockets, the rocket that launched Sputnik, which was literally just called Sputnik.
The Molnaya rocket.
Molnaya, thank you, yep. And they're all based on the R-7 Semyorka, which, when you see the classical Soyuz rocket that does the Korolev cross, where the boosters fall off, looks really cool.
Yep, the world's first ICBM as well.
Correct, liquid-fueled ICBM, so not really rapid time to field, of course. That's probably a conversation for a different podcast. So Korolev, he spent some time in the Gulag. We can get into that a little bit later when we talk about his rivalry with one of the engine designers on pretty much all of these rockets, the N-1 in particular. But Korolev spent some time in the Gulag during the purges of the 20s and 30s, and Stalin saw fit to pull him out after World War II and kind of get him going on the program that kind of happened after the Russians captured the V-2 and they started building their own rocket program.
Back in the good graces of the party. Not uncommon in the Soviet era, especially if you had something to offer.
Exactly. He really lucked out. I've actually been reading a book called Court of the Red Tsar, and he's pretty lucky that he was just kind of one of the underlings, because a lot of the guys closest to Stalin in those days, they didn't get sent to the Gulag, they got shot. So
got sent straight to hell.
Yeah.
Communist hell, which is way worse than American hell.
Well, I mean, communist hell is non-religious, so it doesn't exist.
Communist hell is basically just communist Russia.
Yes, correct.
There's not enough turnips to go around today.
Correct.
Yep, back in the breadline, sucker.
Well,
see you manana.
Turnip bread,
Yeah, turnip bread, yum.
All right, so I kind of talked a little bit about the R-7. The R-7, again, like Zach mentioned, first ICBM, first really viable space launch vehicle, really until the Gemini program, the U.S., was falling on its face with its space program. And then Gemini, we could really demonstrate that we could dock and get ourselves to the moon in Apollo, which, like Zach mentioned in 1960, President Kennedy talking about, hey, we're going to get to the moon. And the other things.
Cuber.
All right, so talked a little bit about the R-7, talked about Korolev himself.
Well, the R7 was a cool thing. It was a way to basically get the military on board with dumping all of this money into space, because the Soviet Union really, aside from the political win of beating America to space, didn't really care. It's all about practical application of these missiles. And the United States was much the same way. A lot of our space launch vehicles really just repurposed ICBMs. So,
yeah, and there's a lot of factionalism, right? You look at like Generals LeMay and Schriever, who hated each other's guts, right? Missiles versus bombers. I mean, on a different scale. It's the eminence of the Cold War and the eminence of ICBMs motivated a lot of this, and people tend to forget that. It's not all peaceful.
Korolev was a pretty skilled politician within the Soviet regime as well, and we'll discuss that more as we go through this, because he got a lot of wins through connections that really should have never made their way into the N-1 rocket program. There were some dudes out there with better ideas, and they just kind of got sidelined because Korolev was such a skilled politician and had his connections.
Yes, Koryulov was. All right, let's see here. What do we have?
I don't speak Russian because I love freedom in America. All right, I'm gonna say Sergei Korolev.
Hey, you can eat your freedom fries over there.
I will.
All right, just don't crunch them in the mic, dog. All right, so
crunch them in my mouth.
All right, so let's get into the M1 rocket itself. So on the American side, right, we had the famous Saturn V, which, of course, got our guys to the moon on the Apollo 11 missions. The previous Apollo missions, other than Apollo 1, which unfortunately was a test that wound up in all the astronauts dying on board, all the previous Apollo missions were kind of a prep for that. So the Saturn V was the super heavy lift booster on the American side, and the N-1 was that on the Soviet side.
Well, it was proposed to be that. They're about equal in size, roughly equal in payload. The design differences are just astounding.
They're vast. Yeah. A lot of that had to do with the caliber of folks, right? So we talked a little bit about paperclip when we started this, right? Us in the U.S., we got the cream of the crop. We got Werner von Braun. We got all of the best dudes. And the Russians kind of just got who was left over. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that those guys did not want to defect to Russia. They had
not a lot of coercion on our part. It was kind of like, hey, man, you want to come work for us, and we won't send you to prison forever. And the Russians like, we're going to put you in prison now and then let you out if you work with us.
Exactly.
And they kind of got the leftovers.
Yeah. And I mean, historically, the Russians, as they invaded, did not have a really good PR campaign, of course. They were raping and pillaging their way across Poland and Germany and everywhere else. So I would definitely want to go with the U.S. too at that point. All right. So the N-1 itself, and you can look up a picture. It's an interesting looking rocket.
It's kind of like a really skinny, tall triangle.
Yeah. Whereas the Saturn V, you can kind of see it's got fins for atmospheric maneuvering. It's kind of a pretty looking rocket. The V2 is definitely aeronautical. The Saturn V is very much so as well, and you can really see that it had the same designer. The N-1 is just kind of like squat and very Soviet-esque. Yeah,
very clear stages because they're separated by scaffolding. It looks weird. They try to air cool it. The whole design is really odd and seems primitive compared to what the Americans were doing.
And a lot of that, right, has to do with the continuity of designers. We'll get into that a little bit further.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit
as we get into that. But really, kind of like we talked about, right? You had the Saturn V on the American side, the N-1 on the Russian side. And the N-1 was intended for moon missions, like I mentioned, but also, interestingly enough, Venus and Mars flyby missions. So it was never going to be able to heft enough weight to land on Venus or Mars and come back, but they had intended to do manned flyby missions, which I find fascinating. Kind of useless in today's day and age with capable probes, but back in those days, manning something was the only way you could do something like that.
Which is just insane, because we're talking about basically being in that rocket for a year to get to Mars and never coming back.
Exactly.
It's a one-way trip.
Well, so with a flyby, you would come back, right? But that was a problem they never actually solved, was how to keep the astronauts alive long enough for them to get back.
Exactly.
Yeah, a one-way trip in that way, yes. In terms of Newtonian and Keplerian physics, no. In terms of lifespan,
it's possible to get back, but
it
never would have happened.
Your corpse will make it back. All right. So we talked a little bit earlier about Koryulov and Glushko. Well, he was the unnamed engineer that I was talking about. The guy Glushko was really the designer of all the engines from the R7 on, and there was a real big rivalry between the two. So Koryulov, there's a theory, hasn't really been founded in history, that Glushko actually denounced Koryulov and got him sent to the Gulag. So these two dudes had to work together.
Yeah, they were not friends, and it's evident throughout the design cycle of all these different rockets that you both are trying to push because they both have their own agenda. They want to be the top guy in the Soviet Union making rockets, and the Soviet Union's interesting because it was really more about your prominence within the party that made you successful, and not so much what you knew. Which I think drove a lot of the issues with the engines and stuff like that on the N-1 rocket.
Yeah, because really the Soviet Union had some of the best. I mean, look at landmass, right? Like, they've got a vast, vast empire to pull from. I mean, they've got pretty much all of the titanium, for instance. So when you talk about like the SR-71, this is off topic a little bit, but the SR-71 was built with titanium alloys. During the Cold War, we actually had to go through shell companies in order to get the titanium to make it from the Soviet Union. So really, they had everything at their disposal, but they hamstrung themselves politically.
Yep, it was about, like I said, your prominence more than your skill. It's
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, we really like this Korolov guy, so yeah, we'll go ahead and let him play around with this rocket and try to get it up there. And people get sidelined and hurt feelings and stuff like that. And it really did not contribute well to the success of really any of their missions. They had a hard time with their rocket program. I'd say a harder time than the Americans did, though we did have kind of a hard time with it.
Big difference with us, right, is we weren't willing to just send dudes into space to die, or to die on launch, right? The human factor was the big difference there. So, I mean, Yuri Gagarin, there's theories, there's lost cosmonauts out there. They sent people up before Yuri Gagarin, but Yuri Gagarin, they did not know if he was going to survive. So really just a big difference in the way they looked at people. And you could see that kind of in their history. Like World War II, they would just send a bunch of guys to go and storm a machine gun nest, and if you died, you died.
2 guys, 1 gun.
Exactly.
You know, your buddy dies, gets shot, you pick up his gun and keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And a meet the gauge
If you
style.
try to turn around, you're going to get shot by your own dudes.
Exactly.
The officers will mow you down.
Bad news bears.
Yeah.
So yeah, Koryulov and Glushko, they didn't like each other. That was obviously the main reason. In terms of being engineers, they had very different views. Glushko was more of a fan of these really toxic hydrazine, hypergolic fuels. That while they're more efficient, they were a lot more dangerous. Koryulov was kind of the good guy of the Russian space program, right? He didn't really want to work people to death. He preferred LOX fuels, so things that were a little more traditional, a little bit lower specific impulse, but a lot safer to work with.
LOX is liquid oxygen.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, we can kind of see just starting off as they started to design the N-1, right? And
Yeah.
again, being a good social scientist, I've got Wikipedia up in front of me here.
Hypergolics were the hotness, too, for everybody back then. It's when you mix 2 liquids and they combust when they combine together. So everybody was using this stuff.
Yeah. So, as we start checking my Wikipedia history here, they first envisioned this in 1959, and really, as they were sitting there, they had a pretty volatile relationship. So it wasn't a very good way to start as it went. All right. So we'll go a little bit into some of the specs of the rocket itself. So this thing was a monster, right? Similar in scope and size to the Saturn V. So 345 feet tall. It was 56 feet in diameter. It weighed greater than 3,000 tons. This is a huge rocket.
To put that in perspective, I mean, if you're a human standing next to this rocket, you're about the size of one of its engines. Not even.
Correct. And we'll get into why that's silly a little bit later, right? So the F1 engine on the Saturn V was massive. You could fit like 20 people inside the engine bell.
Yes.
Not the case with the N1. All right, so yeah, greater than 3,000 tons. In terms of its lift capacity, it could lift 104 tons to low Earth orbit. So, relatively heavy lift vehicle there.
That's pretty heavy even by today's standards. For those of you that aren't really aware of what it takes to get things into outer space, it's a delicate balance between what your rocket and fuel weighs and the amount of payload you want to get into outer space. So 104 tons is pretty freaking big, especially back in the early 1960s.
Yeah. Now again, that's to LEO. That's to low Earth orbit, which is one measure. Importantly for its mission, though, and you can kind of see the big difference in what we're talking about here. 26 tons to what's called TLI, or translunar injection. So you can see that the energy requirement is way different, right?
Do you have the numbers for the Saturn V on that?
No, I don't.
Okay.
So again, pretty heavy lift vehicle, very advanced for its time. Although obviously it was ultimately a failure. Big dreams, right?
Yes.
All right. So 5-stage rocket, with the top stage, of course, being the lunar module and all the things that would take the eventual Soviet cosmonauts to the moon. So they hoped. One interesting thing I'm going to pass over to Zach about is, instead of having kind of a fuel system like the Saturn V had, it had circular fuel tanks. You want to talk to that, Zach?
Yeah, so circular fuel tanks are
Spherical fuel tanks.
or spherical. Yeah, they're not circles or spheres. They're three-dimensional, but they're really inefficient for rocket design. A lot of it has to do with the way they take up space. With conical fuel tanks, like on the Saturn V, you could distribute your weight a little better. You could get your fuel in more efficient places. And also, on the Saturn V, they use that fuel arrangement to help cool the rocket itself, where the N-1 rocket was air-cooled, which, not necessarily a problem, but it was a problem for the N-1 because they had 30 engines on it. And that's just an insane amount of engines. The Saturn V had 5 engines.
Yeah.
This one had 30 on the first stage.
Yeah.
Which is, when we get to it a little bit later, we'll talk about why that's such a tragedy when you're trying to send some stuff in outer space.
Yeah, it was very poorly designed. So I'm looking here at a comparison of the Saturn V and the N1, right? So we kind of talked about some of the different specs there, but like the height, right? So you're looking at the Saturn V, 360 feet tall with payload, 363. The N1, 344, right? Relatively similar in weight, right? So the Saturn V, 6,478,000 pounds. The N1, 6,060,000 pounds, right? So they're very similar. If you look at a side by side, the Saturn V is a little bit taller. It has more to do with the engine bells than anything else.
Yeah, same general idea, just two totally unique ways of going about it, and one worked and the other didn't.
Exactly. And you've got to realize, too, a lot of what we did with the Saturn V was kind of in a vacuum, right? All of our stuff was open source because NASA was unclassified open source. So Russia was able to look at our stuff that we had released through open source and kind of learn from our mistakes. Not so the other way around, which, if you look at the causes of the space race and why they were ahead in the beginning, I'd say that was a big part of it, right? I mean, we didn't really learn from their lessons like they learned from ours.
Well, and there were discussions within the Soviet Union on whether or not to do, let's say, conical fuel tanks instead of circular and the way to cool the rockets. They weren't unaware of what we were doing. They just chose to do the other way for mostly political reasons.
Yeah.
Korolev liked these ideas. He thought they were better. And, I mean, do you want to start talking about engines? I think we should get to engines because that's really, I think, what led to the N1 just not working.
We can, yeah. Korolev was what was kind of to piggyback off what you're saying there. You talked a little bit about Korolev being a very political guy, right? He was titled as the chief designer, right? So in terms of cult of personality, he was a secretive guy. Nobody knew who he was within Soviet Russia for his own safety. But it would be the, mystical, fabled, oh, the chief designer said this, right? There's kind of a cult of personality with that. So
we were the same way with Werner von Braun for a while as well. It took a little bit longer, but it was a closely guarded secret that the guy was a Nazi.
Yeah, don't get me started on Werner von Braun. I mean, we're talking SS major who benefited from slave labor. Not a great guy, but we made him Disney clean, so it's okay.
Yeah, it took quite a lot of time for it to come out that he was a Nazi scientist that was massacring civilians in the UK with these V1 and V2 rockets. So.
Yeah. Let's see here. All right, so Zach kind of already hit on this. 30 engines in the first stage, which, 6 times the amount of engines as Saturn V, which is just freaking asinine.
Yeah, and the other guy that we were talking about what's his name, Glasgow or something.
You're talking about Glushko?
Yeah, Glushko. Yeah, he thought that was ridiculous too.
Yeah.
30 engines. So what? Between this argument between Korolov and Glasgow was they were basically fighting over different people that would work for him, and Korolev lost this one, and he kind of got this subpar engine guy, and the best they could really muster was this tiny engine. And they're like, oh, more is better. We'll just throw 30 engines on this first stage.
Exactly, which really overcomplicates it, right?
Yeah, because the guy just wasn't a good engine designer.
No.
These engines were fine for smaller rockets, sure, but when you're putting 30 engines on a first stage to get something into space, it's basically 6 times the problems you might encounter with a Saturn V. You got 5 engines.
That's a decent social scientist engineering way to say it, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not an engineer, but if we're talking about accepting risk, you're taking 6 times the risk when you have 30 subpar engines on the rocket you want to send to the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
So
we'll talk about this a little more when we get to the failures, right? And kind of just to finish off some of the specs. So all these engines were controlled by a program they used called KORD, K-O-R-D. I don't know off the top of my head the Russian translation of what that acronym is. But it was responsible for making sure all the engines fired in the correct sequence and shut down in the correct sequence. And I would say when we get to the failures, it was the number one cause of all the failures.
yeah, it was this like semi-automated system that would try to detect anomalies and compensate for them in flight, but it didn't work very well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we'll get to why.
Yeah. So again, Saturn V, way more capable, way better designed, but all the stuff we talked about, the continuity problems, everything else, really didn't help the N-1.
Yep, Saturn V worked, the N-1 didn't. So let's get back to the N-1 and talk about that, because we know history and the way it was written and everything that happened. Saturn V was the winner.
Exactly. So one big thing that I think we kind of hit on a little bit, right, was the cult of personality. So Sergei Korolev, he dies, right? He dies, I believe.
1966?
Was it 66?
I think it was 66.
Yeah, Korolev dies around there. I'm not sure of the exact date off the top of my head.
Basically in the middle of this program.
Exactly.
The dude croaks mysteriously.
Well, so a lot of the time that he spent in the gulag, right, was pretty detrimental to his health. So it's been attributed to the fact that he spent a lot of time in the gulag that weakened him sufficiently, which is ironic. It's sad for the Russian space program.
I mean, we could get conspiracy on this. People in the Soviet Union died for whatever reason all the time.
That's fair.
And when you have enemies in a totalitarian regime, you might get sick one day and never recover.
Have a quote-unquote heart attack.
Ouch, I got picked by this umbrella.
Yeah, oh man, yeah.
Oh, sure. Man. I hope there's not a metal bead inside me releasing poison.
Yeah, just a little bit of ricin. All good. So anyways, the guy that takes over as chief designer for Korolev was honestly one of his more incompetent lieutenants, a guy named Vasily Mishin.
Yeah, not an astute politician.
No.
Kind of just,
kind of a dick, honestly.
A dick and a nerd. The guy...
not even a dick and a nerd. Like, really just kind of an alcoholic a-hole, right?
Yeah.
BBC came out with a really good documentary called Space Race.
Imagine the guy that you play Dungeons and Dragons with, and then he just rage quits,
yes,
I don't know, 2 hours in, and he's fucking wasted and just walks off.
Pints and pints of vodka.
Yeah, just straight vodka.
Just all the vodka.
Not even Stoli. We're talking plastic bottle vodka,
yes.
reeks, messy, greasy hair, unshaven, gross, passing out in an alleyway like Edgar Allan Poe.
I mean, a little bit of this is unfounded, but, I'll accept that.
It makes the story more dramatic. I just made up a lot of that. But
it does, yeah.
I'm trying to paint a picture of what kind of guy we're dealing with.
Yeah, historical bias and bad history is kind of what we're at on this podcast.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of this just isn't well known either. So we got to kind of assume that this was that kind of guy. I mean, he was sort of like the protege, but not a good one.
No, very, very incompetent, right? You get a guy like Korolev who is just, he's brilliant. He's good at politicking his way around. He knows how to, shake babies and kiss hands. He's a smart guy, right? So
I like to call it glad handing.
Fair.
People in government do it all the time. Oh, hey, buddy, what's going on?
Exactly. So, yeah, Mission takes over due to various political reasons. Like I was saying earlier, BBC's got a documentary called Space Race that's actually pretty good if you ever want to hear about the entire space race from beginning to end. Really, really interesting. Kind of ends with Apollo 11 landing on the moon, and of course the Russians losing the space race.
Well, I would argue that the space race has never ended. It is the final frontier. Gene Roddenberry, space whales.
Space whales.
Yeah, space whales.
Do you think that's what the N-1 was going to go for? Is the space whales?
Hey, the world may never know
I don't know.
because it never succeeded.
All right, nice segue. All right, so it had 4 launches. You can't see my fingers, but I use launches in quotation marks here.
4 failed launches.
Correct. They were all failures, every single one of them.
Yeah, and part of this has to do with that cord system. Do you want to talk about the first launch?
Yeah.
How do you want to build this up? First launch?
Yeah, we'll go
All right.
sequentially, right? So the first launch, February 21st, 1969. This was the serial number 3 Lima, 3L. And it was trying to test out a Soyuz Zond spacecraft for a moon flyby mission. So really failed a few seconds into launch. Again, cord was a big deal, a big issue when it came to these things.
Yep.
So voltage problems, cord shuts down, right?
Well, the vibration frequency of... So when rockets launch, they shake a lot. And the vibrations caused a lot of issues with cord. Apparently, the vibrations of the rocket launch oscillated at roughly the same frequency that cord was tuned to on the RF spectrum.
Exactly.
And then the whole thing got wonky. Engines started shutting down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something they have to test for, right? If it hits the same harmonic frequency, it can cause all sorts of havoc, right?
And it did.
Yeah. So the first launch, something called pogo oscillations, began a couple seconds into launch, which pogo oscillations sound like what you might interpret them to be, where it's kind of an up and down shaking, just due to a general unbalance, right? So the cord basically just shut down the entire first stage at T plus 68.
Yep. And when your first stage shuts down, you fall from the sky. That's your primary boost mechanism.
Correct.
So that's what's trying to move all of this weight initially from the ground to a little bit higher in altitude.
Fortunately, on the first one, the launch escape system activated. It pulled the more expensive payload, the spacecraft, away, which, I mean, that part was successful, but I would only say tertiarily successful there.
Yep. So that's the first launch.
Yeah,
and again, you have this we're talking about the beginning era of these more complex computer systems. Still nothing compared to what we have today. I mean, your iPhone has the entire computing power of the world, or more so than at this time in the 1960s. So it's pretty basic stuff, and they didn't plan for the oscillations to have that effect on the system to control the rocket and to ensure safety. So
exactly, yeah. So we'll move on to the second launch. The second launch was really the most dramatic one. So this was second launch, 3 July 1969.
And this is the 5 Lima launch. It's 5L is what they called it.
Correct.
The first one was a 3L. This one's a 5L.
So on this one, they said, well, cord didn't work. We're going to go ahead and shut down cord for the first, 15 or 20 seconds of flight, right? Wonderful. But we're forgetting that we have shitty Soviet-built, basically no better than slave labor built engines and technology. So...
Yeah, so an interesting part about that, they would only inspect about 2 out of 5 of the engines that were produced, and none of the engines that were actually going to go on the rocket, which compared to America and what we were doing is just absurd because we tested and retested everything.
Yeah, man rating a rocket was and has been a big deal for us always, right? We test everything. Just we're very, very exact on that.
And this is sort of that ball bearing mentality, like, oh man, if we're producing engines that are bad, then we're all going to end up in jail or shot or whatever for being enemies of the state. Because it's pretty easy to blame a failure on an individual and be like, oh, you guys did this on purpose. You're undermining the Soviet Union, and then all your scientists get purged. But
yeah, bad news bears.
Yeah, it's not good. So it's best just to hide it and say, here, look at this clean, shiny engine that we built. Go ahead and throw it on the rocket.
Exactly.
And you have 30 ones that haven't been inspected on the first stage of a rocket.
Yeah. So, as could be expected, one of the engines has a turbo pump failure. A turbo, it's a little bit engineering heavy what we're talking about, but a turbo pump is what brings the fuel from the actual tanks to the engine. Obviously, turbo pump tells you that it's quick. It's basically got a jet turbine in it that draws the fuel from the tank to the engine. So the turbo pump fails. One of the turbo pumps in the first stage. So the N-1 leans over at a 45-degree angle and drops back onto the launch pad, which the first failure, it just kind of settled down. Yes, it exploded, but it really didn't expose the entire tank load of the rocket. This
Yeah,
time,
this one fell right on their tanks, pretty much.
exactly, yeah, like basically just side on 45 degrees. So,
And again, hypergolic fuels, as a reminder, you mix them and they blow up.
yeah, yeah, not a good time, right? So this was actually one of the largest artificial non-nuclear explosions in human history, visible 22 miles away. So this thing completely just went nuts, right? It was actually our first tip off in the U.S. that they were doing this program. We actually photographed the burn marks from space as our assets flew over. So pretty interesting. All right, so that's the second one we talked about. So
Yep. And also, when rockets aren't designed to just tip over, generally, like if that were to happen now, you'd just blow them up. You'd command destroy them.
Exactly.
So you don't want these things to lean any more than a couple degrees outside of what they are. There's all these different matrices that, you know, do I blow it up? Do I not blow it up? 45 degrees is bad. And they
really
should have
bad.
just, they had some TT&C issues with these. They couldn't necessarily command the rocket.
tracking, telemetry, and control, basically
Yes.
the way that you control a rocket in flight, right? The input and output.
Yep, and the Russians were not good at that. They had it, it just wasn't awesome, and that's kind of what this cord system was. But yeah, so normally you just explode it in air. When these things hit the ground, it's bad news, and the fuel is poisonous too. So you basically have this massive toxic explosion. I wish there was some info on here that talked to that a little bit more.
Yeah, if you check out that documentary that I spoke to, it's got a bunch of things about the accidents that were kind of inherent in these early days, especially in the Soviet Union. And it talks about some of the explosions there and what the hypergolic, what the hydrazine fuels did.
Yep. And there was also an argument between Korolev and
Glushko.
Glushko. Yeah, they were arguing over the toxicity of the fuel, and it's just one of those other things where it's like, oh, we can use this fuel, but it's more efficient. But it's like, well, that the exhaust from that rocket is toxic. You can't breathe it, and it's probably gonna kill people. So
Exactly. All right, so we'll go on to the third failure. Third failure, June 26, 1971. Rocket number 6 Lima, right? So we've already landed somebody on the moon in the U.S. So 1971, this occurs, and again attributed to the cord system, right? So a little more complex here. Cord sends a shutdown command, but it backfired, right? The actual guidance system on the rocket, Cord was semi-independent of the guidance system. Cord was more about the engines. The guidance system fails. And same deal, right? Just stall, spin, crash, burn, and die on this one. On the third failure.
So maybe it was the first failure where one of the engines sort of malfunctioned, and I'm not sure there was anything actually wrong with it, but Cord assumed that there was something wrong with it and it started shutting other engines down to balance it out, and then the rocket just didn't have enough thrust to get up there.
Exactly.
And exploded.
Yeah, the first launch was more of a basically fall straight down. So we'll talk here about we'll go to the fourth and final failure. This is Rocket 7 Lima on November 23rd, 1972. Right at this point, I'm sure the Soviet Union's leadership is getting really tired of funding this, and I'm sure they're getting very impatient, right? So start and liftoff goes well on the fourth failure, right? They're programming a shutdown of the core center 6 engines. They're going to try and do a test, and a hydraulic shock wave occurs, and really just cascades, right? There's a bunch of fuel that spills and ruptures in the internals, and again, crashes, and not successful.
So we're starting to see a trend here.
Yeah.
They're not learning from their mistakes.
No. And they just keep trying.
Yeah, not uncommon for the Soviets to do this, where it's just kind of like try to brute force things on the way through. They get sold on an idea and they keep making it instead of altering the plans.
Exactly. And I mean, part of this is inflexibility because you don't want to go to your boss in the Politburo and say, well, this isn't working, right? You don't want to get sent to the gulag.
Yeah, once something gets blessed in the Soviet Union, you're expected to follow through with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So there was actually a canceled fifth launch. 8 Lima was going to happen in August of 1974, but canceled, right? Launch never took place, and the N-1 at this point in 1974 as a program is canceled. So this is kind of where you see the Russian space program start to take a little different turn. So instead of being concerned with beating us to the moon, which obviously they already lost, they start to focus on different things, namely space stations, right? That starts to be their main focus. So they focus on space stations. They launch Mir. They're instrumental as we go forward in our building of the ISS. Really, again, we can argue they lost the space race, but like Zach said, the space race is still ongoing. It's just all different goals, right?
Well, and we should say Mir was actually a success story for the Soviet Union. It was up there, it worked, it kept astronauts alive.
Yeah, Mir was really the first large-scale successful station. They had a bunch of military stations that were actually used as orbital observation platforms before those satellites were capable. They had some civilian ones. What would they call those? I can't remember what they called the stations themselves. But the Russians really, for things that were in low Earth orbit, were the end-all be-all for a long time. And we really didn't catch up on that front until we got to Skylab. And then from there, we kind of started to build the International Space Station, etc.
Correct. We did. As a team. And the Russian... part of this is kind of misleading, right? Because we're talking about the N-1 and what a failure it was. The Russians did have some really good rocket designs, and they haven't really changed a whole lot, even to today.
No, the Soyuz rockets that still launch folks to the ISS now are a derivative of the R-7 that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. Right, so the Soyuz itself is like a 50 or 60-year-old design, and it's still operating in spec, with some upgrades, of course, but it's still operating, and it's still carrying people to the moon, or not to the moon, to space, to the ISS.
And we trusted enough to put our own astronauts on it, as well as the rest of the world. The Soviets do, or not the Soviets, sorry, the Russians now.
I mean,
a lot of the launches actually go from the Baikonur Cosmodrome.
Yeah,
so
yeah. And I'll definitely plug the fact that as time has gone on, right, we're fortunately starting to become more capable. The space shuttle itself, I don't want to go into an entire history of space on this, but the space shuttle was pretty much an ultimate failure other than the Russian platforms, right? The space shuttle was responsible for the most in-flight deaths of any space launch vehicle. So after the space shuttle failed, we didn't really have a way to get there. So we're starting to go more towards an American crewed, American built, and American launched space lift vehicle. So it's pretty exciting times. We're trying to head back to the moon. We're trying to do all sorts of good stuff.
Yep, and it's all done through the civilian marketplace. So that competition for space lift and space access is driving more innovations. We have SpaceX now, ULA, all these people with competing designs. And really, the Saturn V was a government project.
Yeah, the Saturn, but you had one. I mean, you had one unifying ideology. It was beat the Russians, right? We don't really have things like that anymore. There's no unifying ideology that we're trying to go up against.
That's right. But space, it's going to continue to be interesting, and we'll do some more space podcasts. This is a special interest of Ben and I. We really enjoy space. We think it's neat.
Yeah, both Zach and I are 13 Sierras. So what that means is we do space for a living in the Air Force, soon to be Space Force. So it's something that we're kind of trained on, and we enjoy talking about. Me, of course, Zach's a political scientist. I'm a historian. So the history of space is a very, very strong interest of mine.
Yep. And, we enjoy talking about this stuff. And again, we talked about it last time. If you guys have any suggestions about what you want to listen to or any ideas that you might want to learn more about, we'd be happy to talk about them. We love history and politics and basically everything that made most things in history work. The story goes a lot deeper than what you're typically taught in school, and we try to touch at least a little bit of that, so we can kind of have our own take on what things are. We don't necessarily try to steal what other people are saying. We have our own opinions about these sort of things. We're not published by any means. We just want to talk about the things. But if you want something and want to hear about a certain historical event, we'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, go ahead and shoot me an email. My email information is available on Libsyn. I'm on Facebook. I'm on YouTube. We're actually on Spotify now, which just saw that about a week ago, so that's exciting.
If you like what you hear, tell your friends.
Yep. Like, share, subscribe, hit us up. Zach, think we're about good on that?
I think we're good.
All right. Appreciate y'all listening.
Yep. Keep drinking beer. Keep reading books.
That's right.
Learn some history.
That's right. Stay smart. Take it easy.
Yep. Bye.